Welcome to this lecture on basics of budget preparation. The topics that we are going to cover in this video are budget basics, then we are going to talk about budget functions and budget purpose. We are then moving on to budget preparation, and finally we are going to talk about governmental funds and governmental accounting. Note that for now we are going to focus on what are called recurrent budgets as opposed to capital budgets. Recurring budgets are financing current expenditures with current revenues. Capital budgets is the financing of large expenditures with multi-year lifespan with future tax revenues due to fairness issues. So for example, if you're thinking about building a new bridge, then that bridge is going to have a multi-year lifespan, which also benefits people that are going to move to the region later on. And due to fairness issue, you are going to finance that bridge through debt financing over multiple years. But we will see, or we will talk more about this in future videos. Now let us talk about the basics of budgeting. So first, let us start with your personal budget. Think about your personal situation and then you decide to actually put a budget together. Basically, what that budget would do is it would be a planned allocation of your revenue or of your income, your wage, to various categories such as housing, food, apparel, or healthcare. You would have various competing considerations regarding the allocation of funds, depending on your marital status, the number of children, or even the expected income that you have. Of course, you will also have to think about the availability of rainy day funds. Rainy day funds means that if something unexpected happens, or if there's an unexpected expense, for example, you need a car repair, then your budget also needs to plan for that. Most likely, you are also going to make the distinction between routine expenditures, recurrent budgets, for example, for food items, as opposed to long-term investments, such as purchasing a new car or purchasing a new TV. If you're putting a personal budget together, this will likely improve your financial situation because of the budget. The same is true for governments. Now, think about budgeting as the process of developing and implementing as well as evaluating a budget. The political scientist Aaron Wildavsky has two quotes with regard to budgets. First, it says that the budget is the lifeblood of the government, the financial reflection of what the government does or intends to do. The second quote states that the crucial aspect of budgeting is whose preferences are to prevail in disputes about which activities are to be carried on and to what degree, in light of limited resources. So think of budget as a plan to allocate public resources. You will see that there is no policy without a budget. You can think of budgets as a decision guide, in the sense that it is a decision guide for the government of which goods and services to provide. There are public choices or there are policy choices made by the government when it puts together a budget because it allocates revenues as well as expenditures. There are many things to consider when putting together a budget, and that is, for example, the types and extent of goods and services provided by the public. But there are also more philosophical questions, such as, for example, the size of government relative to the private sector, or even the relative size of departments and agencies within the government. So you can think about the resource allocation, for example, to the Department of Energy, of Transportation, of Defense, or Education. A budget also lays out the methods to raise revenue. Now, there are some aspects to consider when you're thinking about budgets and public policy. First, as a policymaker, you may have multiple objectives that are going to be reflected in your budget. Here we are looking at two examples. So think about subsidizing school lunches, both to feed children as well as to create income support. The second example is if you are thinking about establishing or allowing needle exchanges for drug users in order to hit two objectives. First, to reduce the public health risk associated with HIV infections, as well as reduce the cost associated with HIV infections. For example, the lifetime treatment cost of an HIV infection is estimated to be close to $380,000 by the Center for Disease Control. As a policymaker, you may have also conflicting objectives. So think about, for example, if you have a water reservoir that has the purpose of flood control as well as the purpose of recreation. Then an empty reservoir may be better for flood control, but may be bad for recreation and vice versa. Also note that as a policymaker, there may not be standard measures to evaluate the various objectives. So for example, the measure to measure the gains from cleaner waterways is going to be different than the measure of reducing traffic fatalities. Budgets can also be, or policy in general, can also be place-based versus people-based resource allocation. So here, the following, you can think about that you can invest either in people or you can invest in places. This is actually a quote from the New Yorker, and the article is called "The Other Side of Broken Windows." And it basically highlights that if cities were to spend $1 in taxpayer money, or if they were to invest $1 of taxpayer money, that there could be a return between $5 to $26 in net benefits to taxpayers, and between $79 and $333 to society at large. And that investment would consist of treating abandoned buildings and vacant lots. Note that even a city like Indianapolis, there are many abandoned buildings and vacant lots, and those buildings and lots may actually not only attract crime, but they may also decrease property values in the surrounding neighborhoods. If you're thinking about, in general, about public policy and how they relate to budgets, then based on the examples I have given, you should already have noticed that putting a budget together can be very confrontational. So think about the needle exchange that I talked about before. Then that needle exchange may not be necessarily favored by policymakers. Of course, a budget, since there are many stakeholders involved, is also participatory, in the sense that you need to take into account the various views and preferences of the stakeholders. And by its very nature, it is also compromising, in the sense that you may be asking, if you are a unit director, you may be asking for a particular allocation of funds, but you may be not able to get those funds due to a compromise that you have to do with another unit. Now, of course, when we are talking about budgets, there are also the clash between budgets and reality, in the sense that think about a budget as a theoretical document of how money should be spent and how money should be raised. Most budgets, or during the budget development process, there are forecasts over the budget time horizon. But those forecasts may not come to fruition. So think about, for example, that you are calculating or you are expecting a certain economic growth, and that forecast of economic growth is then the basis for the expected tax revenue as well as the expenditures. Think about expenditures here, for example, in terms of transfer payments for unemployment insurance. Depending on how the economic growth actually is realized, in the sense that you have a high or low economic growth, that may mean very different revenue streams as well as expenditure streams. You can also think about the amount of snowfall that is a forecast for public roads or public works agency or Department of Transportation, but how the Department of Transportation responds to that snowfall, to that expected snowfall, that is actually policies. So there are maybe different policies based on identical forecasts, and if you have different policies, that also requires different budgets. We also have to think about budgets and rhetoric. So for example, there was a statement made by a governor, and it said that, "For education, I maintain our commitment from last year and note that my budget includes direct educational grants to cities and towns of $2 billion. Now, this may actually not be necessarily true if you think, for example, that the educational service may have increased in price due to inflation, or there may also be more students. In that sense, because you have more students, that also means you would have fewer funds available per student. So the term to maintain may actually not be correct if the services have actually decreased. Now, let us next move to budget function and budget purpose. Here we are going to look at 4 budget functions. First, we think about the budget as a financial plan that tells governments of how to allocate financial resources. We then move on to the budget as an operations guide that specifies the activities to achieve certain policy goals. A budget is also a policy document in the sense that it outlines the policy priorities and how resources are allocated to high priority areas. And lastly, we also look at budgets as a communication device, because think about the budget as being the spending and revenue from taxpayer monies and back to taxpayers, and that requires a certain transparency as well as accountability. Note that the focus of initial budgets was actually on theft prevention. Now, let us have a look at budgets as a financial plan. So basically, the budget lays down the financial implications of governing given anticipated operating environments. Anticipated operating environments basically refers back to forecasts. Budget specifies the revenue-raising policies as well as the resource allocation. It projects revenue and spending over the tax period, and it also has to make sure that the revenue and the spending are actually aligned, in the sense that the expenditure or the spending is not exceeding the tax revenue or the revenue. Of course, a budget should also outline what happens in case there's a difference between revenues and expenditures. Here you can think back about the example that I gave before about changing economic growth and how it would result in changes in revenue and expenditures. So for example, if the economic growth slows down, that may actually decrease revenues and increase expenditures. And the budget should outline of how this problem is going to be addressed. As a financial plan, a budget also imposes financial discipline and control, in the sense that it makes sure that funds are only spent for specified purposes that are outlined in the budget. It also assigns the responsibility of who is actually able to do the expenditures. Budget also provides the legal authorization for spending money. Now, the budget is also an operations guide, in the sense that it outlines the efficient and cost-effective provision of public services. It describes the activities and the services that are provided by the organizational units. So for example, you may have the budget of the Department of Transportation, and there you have one unit that is responsible for the snow removal. Then the budget as an operations guide would allocate the function of snow removal to that organizational unit. It also outlines the goals for individual agencies, units and programs, as well as the personnel or how many people are actually going to be used. As an operations guide, it has also legal implications in the sense that the budget has to ensure that the activities are actually within the legislative intent and conform to legal restrictions or to current laws. Finally, a budget is also a policy document and a communication device. We have mentioned this before, that as a policy document, the budget articulates the long-term goals and objectives of the agency or of the executive branch. It also presents and evaluates alternatives to achieve those objectives and specifies long-term priorities as well as long-term financial challenges. And lastly, a budget is also a communication device to the public and to stakeholders. Because remember, as a public agency, you are spending taxpayer money and you are also providing services to taxpayers. And hence, the budget as a communication device communicates the priorities and the policy directive to stakeholders, but it also informs citizens of the government activities, which increases the transparency and also the accountability. Now, there are many more items on budgets or issues on budgets, and we are going to look at those in the upcoming videos. You can also think about there are two items that I would like to cover briefly here, and that is the way of structuring budget information within a budget. So you can think about the structure of a budget, which can be either administrative or centered around administrative units, on economic activity, or on actually functions. So think about if it's focused on administrative units, then it basically allocates funds to agencies in the sense that it specifies of how much should be spent on fire department, how much should be spent on the police department, how much should be spent on schools, etc. It could also be centered on economic items such as wages and salaries, or on utilities. Think about utilities as all the electric or natural gas bills that are encountered by fire and the police department. A budget can also focus on the functional aspects of service provision. Think about function could be the public health. Then public health or public safety would actually be would include, for example, fire department, police, but also public health agencies. Now, when a budget is put together, it also has to account for unexpected events such as an economic downturn. In order to take into account those unexpected events, there could be, for example, a budget stabilization fund, or the budget could underestimate revenues or overestimate expenditures. Now, let us next look at the budget preparation. So, the budget preparation, or think about this as the public budget cycle, is basically involving 4 steps that are recurring every year or every 2 years. And note that those steps are also overlapping. So if you're thinking about, for example, the federal or the state government, and note that we are going to talk about this federal government in more detail in upcoming videos. We could have the executive preparation. We have then the legislative review and approval. We have the budget implementation that provides goods and services to the public. And then we have audit and evaluation. What I mean by overlapping process, you can think about when the current budget is implemented, that the executive branch may already be preparing the new budget for the upcoming year. So let us look at the executive preparation. The executive preparation basically starts with a forecast of the economic climate and projections in terms of revenue and expenditures. Based on those projections, there will be a budget call and guidelines, and the budget call basically outlines the executive priorities. think about here as the policy priorities, but it may also outline the limits of expenditure growth driven by the revenue forecasts. So for example, if the government expects there to be lower tax revenue coming in, then that forecast of tax revenue may then actually limit of how much individual government units can increase their expenditure. A budget call and guidelines, of course, has also budget preparation instructions and a definition of the fiscal year. For the federal government, the fiscal year starts on October 1. Once the agencies or the individual units, they are evaluating of how they are going to provide a public demand for service, or how they are going to provide goods and services demanded by the public, then they are preparing and submitting a budget to the executive branch. Once the executive branch has finished their budget preparation, it submits that budget to the legislative branch. And that branch may have different priorities or may take more into account the constituents, the interests of the individual constituents. Note that there may also be appropriation. Note that it may also look at that the appropriations, or what is actually allowed to be spent, are within limits. The legislative branch may actually do recommendations and modifications, but is going at some point to adopt the budget, and basically is drafting what are called final appropriation bills that basically allow the executive to spend money. Once we have the final appropriation bills, then we can also start to implement the budget. Implementing the budget means that agencies can now deliver services to the public. Of course, those agencies have to be cognizant that there may be legal spending limits and also legal restrictions of how the money can be spent, because the money can only be spent in accordance with the budget. Agencies also have to avoid deficit spending, in the sense that they are spending more money than they are allocated to. Finally, we have an audit and evaluation, in the sense that we are looking at what was the budget, what was the proposed budget, and how did that budget at the end of the budget period, how did it actually look like? Of how much money was spent? Were all the funds spent legally? Also, it is a management audit, in the sense that were the priorities outlined in the budget, were they are actually achieved, and how did the individual agencies perform? Usually those audit and evaluations are done by an independent auditor. Basically, you have an external review that looks at the budget execution and then reports back to the legislator and the public.